Welcome to today's All Ireland Women's Forum webinar event on the work ongoing across Europe and across the island of Ireland to increase women's representation in political and public life. Some housekeeping first. Today's event is being interpreted by Vanessa and Sarah, and we thank them so much for their participation. We'll have a number of speakers today, and you'll have the opportunity to ask questions. Please use the chat box function, and I'll put your questions to the floor. Today's event is part of the work of the All Ireland Women's Forum. The Forum is a collective of women from across the island, north and south. It's a space for building north-south links, addressing the needs of marginalized communities, building better understanding and inter-community links, and highlights the issues of most relevance to women across the island. At its core, it aims to address the underrepresentation of women in peace-building, civic society, and public life. Women's representation is essential to the quality of our democratic processes. All levels of government should be representative of the larger society in terms of gender, class, age, minorities, if it's to be a democratic one. In Ireland, the gender quota applied to Dáil elections saw the number of women elected jumping from 16% in 2011 to 22% in 2016. However, progress stalled in 2020, with women's representation moving only half a percentage. This places Ireland 98th in the world for women's representation in national parliaments, falling behind countries such as China, Chad, and Iraq. Following the 2022 NI Assembly elections, women now make up 35.5% of those elected. This was really seismic, considering that historically, Northern Ireland has had the lowest proportion of women's representation among all UK devolved institutions. The low number of women candidates who ran in this year's local election in the North was frustrating, with women only making up 31.8% of candidates across all local authorities. However, on assessment of the election results, we see that 31.5% of candidates elected were women, showing that when women are on the ticket, they get elected. But at the current rate, it would take another 5 electoral cycles or 20 years until we reach parity at the polls. This is really unacceptable. A critical mass of 40% of women is needed to have impact and change outcomes for women. So, to set the context, I want to say a couple words about the barriers to women's full participation. And I'm sure none of this will come as a surprise to our listeners today. We've heard a lot about the 5 C's over the years. Evidence suggests that sexist attitudes and gender-based violence against women candidates and representatives remain a real barrier to achieving gender equality in politics. Threats and harassment, particularly online, act as a deterrent to women who are considering running for election. Research undertaken between 2020 and 2021 revealed that female councillors in the Republic of Ireland received 8 times as many abusive tweets per follower than their male colleagues. This has to be addressed head-on. Political parties are best placed to create pathways for women into elected politics and must commit to supporting women. This doesn't just mean building individual women's confidence and capacity. It requires reviewing and potentially overhauling internal party processes and cultures. Income disparity between men and women continues to be a barrier to women's participation, but crucially, caring responsibilities continue to be cited as a major obstacle for people considering entering and remaining in politics. This doesn't simply affect women, of course, but councillors we've engaged with tell us they feel they have a triple shift. They do their paid work, they do their caring for children or other family members, and then they do their political office work. The way political office has been traditionally structured is antiquated, and it really needs assessment. They're not designed to cater for people who need additional types of supports, and not everybody has the type of flexible support at home that might be required for late night meetings or ad hoc constituency engagements. That's why, with the support of the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage, the National Women's Council have launched a toolkit for local authorities. You'll see that here. So this is around enabling and supporting women, parents and carers in local government. And we're going to email this to you all today, all the registered participants. The toolkit's designed to provide options and to spark ideas and actions. Having carried out an exhaustive survey of councillors and local authorities, the toolkit builds on really good practices that are already taking place around the country. It has to be remembered that traveller and Roma women, working class women, disabled women, migrant women, the LGBTQ+ community, and women in rural communities who often experience the impact of policy making the most, face additional barriers in achieving full and equal participation in public and political life. The provision of adequately resourced quality public services, particularly childcare, is essential for reducing poverty and improving access to public participation. Gender-based abuse of female politicians has to be tackled. Family-friendly policies need to be adopted, and women need to be put forward by political parties for seats that are winnable. The barriers to women's representation have been well documented. What's urgently needed now is the political will to address them. And while measures to erode the structural barriers that prevent women from entering into public office and to support women as candidates are vital, this needs to be happening in parallel with quotas. So today we're calling for the implementation of gender quotas at local government level, alongside the introduction of measures to tackle and make local government accessible. We're in the cusp in the South of the next local and European elections in 2024. Urgent action is required now to ensure that we have equal numbers of men and women on the ballot papers in every local electoral area in the country. So now I'm going to introduce you to our wonderful panel today. Can I ask all our speakers to turn on their cameras? So our speakers today, they're going to talk to you about the ongoing work that's happening right across Europe and across Ireland to increase women's representation. So with us, we have Jéromine, who is the Policy and Campaign Officer with the European Women's Lobby. The European Women's Lobby is the largest European umbrella network of women's associations, representing 2,000 organizations in the EU, coming together to campaign for their common vision of a feminist Europe. Jéromine is responsible for the Women in Decision-Making portfolio and focuses on gender mainstreaming in EU policies. Some of the specific topics she works on include parity democracy and the Women on Boards Directive, and she's currently leading EWL's work on the 2024 EU elections. Next, we're going to hear from Katie Deegan, who is the Communications and External Relations Coordinator for Women for Election. Women for Election has supported over 4,000 women from all over Ireland to enter and succeed in politics. Many women who've come through their programs now sit on councils in the Dáil, in the Seanad, and even the European Parliament. Their vision is an Ireland with equal representation of women in Irish politics. They lead in bringing about women's full participation in political life and challenging and working within the political system. And Katie joined Women for Election in October 2022. And before that, she worked in Munster House in a political press office doing digital media. Last but not least, we'll hear from Aoife Clements from 50/50 NI. Aoife is actually the founder of 50/50 NI, who are working towards a Northern Ireland where women are equally represented at all political levels. They do this by raising awareness of the issue and advocating for political parties to adopt gender-positive policies. They also run training programs and events to encourage and support women who want to get into politics. And with a background in politics herself, Aoife is very passionate about gender equality and including women in the legislative procedure. So I want to just say to our participants, thank you very much for being with us. Feel free to pop your questions into the chat box. And Jéromine, we will start with you.
Thank you very much, Rachel, for the introduction and for the invitation. I will share my presentation now. I think it should be working. Okay, I'll put it full screen. Here we go. So thanks for the introduction, Rachel. I was invited to talk about women's representation in politics across Europe, specifically because the European Women's Lobby has issued a recent study on this topic, which I will introduce to you briefly in a bit. So as I said, I would be talking about women in decision-making in politics, their representation at EU level to set the stage a little bit, or work at the European Women's Lobby really shortly, and then mostly focusing on the studies and sharing some of the findings for the Republic of Ireland, which Rachel already highlighted some of the stats we also have in the studies, so that's good. So just to set the scene, I wanted to focus a bit on political culture across Europe and across the world in general, with two quotes that you can see on the screen. The first one is from a journalist that commented on at a news conference where both at the time prime ministers of New Zealand and Finland, Jacinda Ardern and Sanna Marin, met. And he commented on the fact that people would be apparently wondering whether the two were meeting just because they were similar in age and had a lot of stuff in common. I'm sure you saw that in the news and you were probably quite outraged too by this quote. Another one is a bit older and happened at the level of the European Parliament in 2017 and is from a Polish member of the European Parliament. This happened during a debate on gender pay gap, and he basically voiced his opinion that women must earn less because they are weaker, smaller, and less intelligent than men. So this is unfortunately the kind of environment and political culture that women leaders in politics have to deal with and support, and this kind of sexist attacks really hamper women empowerment, their access to decision-making position, and these stereotypes and gender norms or these normative gender roles and critiques or opinions of women capacity as leaders really hampers their opportunity to access decision making. Also, this translates into the fact that obviously as women, the concern of women in all their diversity are not replicated in the political agenda and policies are less responsive. So just a few data on women in decision making that for most of you might be aware of, but the 2022 IGE Gender Equality Index, so IGE, the European Institute for Gender Equality, and last year index highlighted the fact that in the subdomain of power, Europe as a whole scored as 57.2 points. So the closer you are to 100, the better it is, and the more gender equal, like you reach gender equality if you reach 100. Obviously, no one is at that level, unfortunately. And this score for the sub-level of political power is the lowest score of all domains. And it's interesting to know that there is another score for power in general, which also includes economic power and which is a bit higher. But the score in terms of powers, being political power, economic power, has none like a really great increase in terms of improvement, but this was driven mostly because of the progress in terms of women on board legislation. So political power is kind of falling behind. So in the EU, women represent only 33.4% of ministers in EU member states and 33% of members of the parliament. These are stats from 2022. Obviously, there are a lot of disparities according to the country you focus on. So Sweden is faring really well, as you can see, and Hungary pretty poorly with only 14% of its member of parliament being women. There has been progress in the latest years. So, for instance, the current College of European Commissioners is made of 13 women out of 27 commissioners, and MEPs, there are 39% of women in the European Parliament being women. However, European institutions are still far from diverse. So if you look specifically at the European Parliament, you have only 17 female members of the European Parliament coming from ethnic minorities. And there is still a lot to do to tackle vertical and horizontal segregation. So I think one quite recent example when it comes to vertical segregation is looking at the COVID crisis. Despite the fact that women were highly impacted by the COVID crisis and made most of the front burner workforce, only a quarter of health ministers in the EU were women in March 2021, which means that when policies impacting their life, then professional environments were made, they were not represented adequately. And when you look at like vice minister of health or junior ministers, it was only 4 out of 10 that were women too. And if you look at horizontal segregation, looking at the EU level, for instance, once women manage to access decision-making positions, they are still kept at undervalued topics, what we call soft portfolios, so like economic policies, social policies, for instance, rather than maybe the Ministry of Economy or Finance or Trade. And if you look at the European Parliament level, in the Committee on Women's Rights and Gender Equality, about 91% of the members in this committee are women. And if you look at the Committee on Constitutional Affairs and the one on Budget, men represent respectively about 85% of the members and 75%. So there is improvement, but still quite a bit of progress that can be made. So quickly, what we do at the European Women's Lobby for the portfolio of women in decision-making in politics, we advocate for the adoption of binding measures to ensure that female candidates are placed at electable places on candidate lists, specifically by making compulsory the use of alternation methods, like for instance, zip list. So recently we worked on the EU electoral law, for instance, and we also published the study that I will dive into a bit later on taking stock of women's representation in politics across Europe. And we are preparing for the upcoming EU elections campaign. So the study that I have with me today and is available online too, I'll share the link later on in the chat. We really worked on this study because we wanted to inform EU policymaking and to encourage binding measures to advance equal representation of women in decision-making in EU institutions. We had also requests from some of the EU politicians we work with, an interest to know, what were the different legislation in the different EU member states. So we decided that it would be good to have some sort of mapping of what was the current state of women in decision-making in EU countries, and highlighting the different pieces of legislation and also initiatives existing in different countries. And part of the study also focuses on the EU legal framework and precedents. For this study, we had external pro bono help from EU lawyers that specifically focused also on the EU legal framework. And we did not only focus on the EU as a European Union, we also included European countries as in the continent. So you will see, for instance, in the study the UK, there is also Turkey, because there are also interesting examples to look at. And we use this study both to lobby on women in decision-making, so in my daily work, let's say, but also for content and advocacy in the framework of the campaign we will do on the election. And we have two different versions of the study, the one I showed you in print and the one online. And the online version is the most complete one. Well, we had a choice to make when printing, basically, and we couldn't print something too long. The print is already about 70 pages. But basically, on the online version, you will have the EU legal precedent, the legal framework, 20 national case studies on what are the legislation on women in decision-making. You will also have a bit of a small part on what EU political groups are doing when it comes to the representation of women in decision-making. So our key findings now. So what we found is that there is scope for ambitious EU-wide legislative measures, because if you consider the disparity between EU member states when it comes to compliance culture and gender equality progress, it's important to harmonize that through the EU and to set certain standards and legally binding instruments. And for that, the study showed that it's critical to have clear requirements, but also effective and proportionate sanctions, and follow through with proper implementation, obviously. There are a few European countries with gender balanced parliaments, despite the fact that they have no mandatory quotas. So these stats are from 2022. So obviously, I guess there are the usual suspects when it comes to gender equality. So Iceland has a bit more than 47% of its MPs being women. For Sweden, it's 46% approximately, and Finland 45.5%. I will go back to these types of country later on and focus a bit more on voluntary party quotas. It's important to keep in mind that this kind of success really depends on the political culture in the country, the tradition when it comes to gender equality, the strength of the women's rights movement in the country. So they are a great example, but sometimes progress cannot be sustained or needs really specific conditions to happen. The study showed that the EU member states with higher standards when it comes to women's representation in politics are Sweden, Finland, Spain, Belgium, France, Denmark, the Netherlands, and Portugal. And the ones with the lowest standards on these specific topics are Cyprus, Malta, and Hungary. We mostly looked at the representation of women in national assemblies and also a bit, the legislation passed, etc. So this is one of the illustrations you can find in the studies. So in purple, you see the countries which have legislative candidate quotas. So you see, for instance, France, Poland, Greece, Italy, Portugal, the Republic of Ireland, Belgium. And we also show the different type of sanctions that exist in these specific countries. So you have two big type of sanctions: rejection of the list and financial sanction. And I will get back to that a bit later on. So now looking into our results. So we looked into 20 European countries, and you have the list in the study. We found out that among the countries that we surveyed, 47% had legislated candidate quotas. All of them had specific target to be reached. The minimum target when it comes to this type of legislation is 30% of women being placed on the election list. But for most of the country we studied that had legislated candidate quotas, the minimal requirement was 40% of women be put on the list. Then we also looked at what type of quota was required, because not all quota systems are equal in terms of success and results. So we saw that 56% of the country that had this type of quota requested the use of alternation method, for instance, zip list. So that was the case for Belgium, France, Italy, and Spain, for instance. And in 2022, when we looked at this specific country, we looked at what level of governance they were applied as per their law. So in 78% of the cases, they applied to the subnational level, so city, regional, departmental level. In 100% of the country, they applied to single and lower house of parliament. Only 56% of the countries had the quota law applying to the upper house and 44% to the EU elections. So that's the European Women's Lobby believes that quotas, binding quotas, is one of the most effective tools to fast-track women's representation in elected bodies of government. And the study also showed that when you looked at the results. And if you look, for instance, at the evolution of the proportion of women, when you look at parliamentary seats across Europe, in 2024, you had 18% of women among members of parliament, and in 2021, you had 34%. And in this span of time, in particular between the 2010 and 2020, quite a few member states adopted and implemented binding quota measures. So, as I said, not all quota systems are equivalent, and what we saw during the study is that there is a need for this legally binding instrument, but it's important to have the adequate sanction, depending also on the electoral system, the list structures. It's really important to see how the quota system is developed and implemented. But in terms of sanctions, financial penalties don't really have a great deterrent effect, either because they're not implemented, like we could see in Greece, or because they are already factored in the political parties' budgets. So, for instance, in France, in the legislative election in 2017, that's what happened. So despite having a legislation asking for the political party to put at least 40% of their candidate being women, and to a certain level having alternation, quite a few main parties didn't comply with the legislation, and they had factored for the fine within their budget. So the 17 biggest political groups in France that ran for the election paid a total of 2.18 million euros in fine. So you can see that financial penalty, when the parties have the means, is not really deterrent. What works better is the rejection of the list if the list is not compliant with the quota law. But we need to see the sanction implemented, obviously, and it's not the case, for instance, in Greece. There are also sometimes not sanctions, but incentives, like financial incentives. So Croatia, for instance, has adopted financial bonuses, but it's not sufficient when you look at the increase in women's representation in Croatia and in similar countries. So now looking at voluntary party quotas, some countries like Sweden, Iceland will show that if you have the right condition, then you don't need legislative candidate quotas. However, progress is not guaranteed. It's not guaranteed that the progress will be sustained, and this kind of success really depends on parties' political will. So Iceland is a really good case, and that was highlighted by one of our national members at the EWL. Currently, you have 4 out of 8 parties in the Icelandic parliament that have internal guidelines on equal representation of women in candidate lists, with some system of alternation, including at the top seats of the list. In 2017, during the legislative election, the number of women in parliament dropped by 10 percentage points. And this was because 2 new parties entered the parliament, and this party had not implemented voluntary party quotas. So we can see that there is a need for a legislative quota to have, some sort of secure progress, even in this Nordic country that are usually faring quite well in terms of gender equality. So when we looked at the countries that had legislated binding quotas, we also looked at the impact it had on legislation, in particular if it was advancing women's rights and gender equality. So we looked, for instance, at France and Spain and Portugal, and we saw a positive relationship. So for instance, in France, in 1997, you had about 11% of the seats of the National Assembly being held by women. In 2022, it was about 37%. And the parliamentary term between 2017 and 2022 was the one which was the closest to gender balance, and it passed quite a few legislation advancing women's rights. So for instance, legislation on gender equality and gender-based violence. They also adopted an index for professional gender equality. So the index applies to companies which have over 50 employees, and they request them to calculate the index based on gender pay gap, bonus gap, for instance. And if the index is below 75, then the company has to take measures to address these inequalities within the 3 years. Obviously, it's important to have monitoring and a follow-up, but this is a legislation that was an improvement linked to the better representation of women in the parliament. This parliament also passed quite a few pieces of legislation on domestic violence, some of them granting a right to asylum to migrants, women, migrants victims of domestic violence, for instance. In Spain, it was the same kind of observation that we saw. So in 1979, there were only about 5% of MPs that were women in the parliament, and this raised to about 43% in 2019. And the parliament that got elected in 2019 adopted quite a few significant legislation when it came to gender equality, the fight against gender-based violence, and I think one of the most significant one was the amendment of the Spanish criminal code with the law of only yes means yes, so recognizing that only a clearly expressed yes equals consent to engage in a sexual relationship. So we also tried to look at intersectionality and if there were any specific measures to ensure that women in all their diversity were represented. So looking at women with disabilities, for instance, women from ethnic minorities, etc. And we couldn't find much, unfortunately. What we saw is that in Wales, there was a specific purpose committee on the Welsh National Assembly, and their electoral reform, and EWL's Welsh members, so When Wales, led a diverse 50-50 campaign there, pushing for the adoption of a legally binding gender quota. And the special purpose committee concluded that they were in favor of the introduction of binding quotas. However, when it came to diversity quotas that weren't based on gender criteria, they thought that this requested further examination and that they just encouraged so far political parties to publish diversity and inclusion strategy. So we think that's quite a gap still in European countries and at the EU level. We have another member that published a study in 2021, so the European Network of Migrant Women, and they studied quite a bit the political participation of migrant women. And in this specific study, they concluded that the stereotyping and traumatizing experience of young migrant women led to them having a distorted view of their capacity and their role within the society, which then created internal barriers to their political representation, which means that their voice are reduced to silence when it comes to political participation and representation, also because they don't see a lot of role models with their same background. So the Republic of Ireland, I think Rachel gave quite a few data on that. Maybe I won't develop too much, and you have it in the study, but in the Republic of Ireland, so there are legislative quotas only for national elections, so they do not apply at subnational level. And the main legislation is the 2012 Electoral Act, and this legislation links state funding of political party to the compliance with the quota law. The target was 30%. From this year onward, the target is meant to increase to 40%. And non-compliance means a cut of 50% in state funding. There are also voluntary party quotas taken up by party according to their own will. It's important to see that despite the lack of binding quota at national level, there has been a progress, but really slow progress. And when we compare that with the evolution that happened at national level in the representation of women in the National Assembly, in the lower house of the Assembly, it's interesting to see that even though there is still a lot of progress to do, the increase was better with mandatory quotas. So I have this stat somewhere. Sorry, I'll look at it again. Yes, so, sorry. Yeah, okay. So in 2011, there were about 15% of women in the lower house. And in 2016, which is from what we saw, the first general election in which quota were implemented, the increase in representation was 5 percentage points. And it's quite small, I would definitely agree. However, this increase previously was observed over 5 electoral cycles. So there is still a lot of progress to make, but binding quotas are a bit more effective. And that's why a lot of the civil society organization in the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, as some of you belong to, push for the adoption of quota at local level, because a lot of study observes too that it's local mandates for women that usually facilitates also the election at national level. And there is another study that we looked into, more looking at one of the barriers that Rachel mentioned earlier, which is violence against women politicians. And this Galway study from 2020 saw that 96% of current and former women politicians at the time, at national and local level, had received social media or email messages using threatening and hateful language, and 3/4 reported being threatened with physical violence online or via social media. So here is the stat I mentioned earlier, and looking a bit back since 1918, from all the members of the parliament that were elected in the lower house, only 10% of these members are women, compared to 90% men, sorry, in the Republic of Ireland. So this is me to my conclusion. At the EWL, we believe and we advocate for banning quota because we believe they are temporary and necessary tool. There is a need for other, obviously, policies advancing gender equality and women's rights, as Rachel mentioned, to tackle violence against women and girls, to have a more equal share of caring responsibility. There is a need also to address finance for women running for elections, address sexism and education efforts. So all of that combined will lead to a more equal representation of women at decision-making position in politics. However, quota are really efficient tool if they are designed and implemented properly, because we can observe, this is a stat from Deegan, that countries without binding quotas, so legislated candidate quotas, will take up to 60 years to achieve gender parity in parliament, while countries with mandatory quotas would reach gender parity in 20 years' time. So for us, the conclusion, and which is also shown through the study, is that natural progress is not enough, and that's why we need proactive measures, and that's why the EWL did this study to try to inspire more ambitious measures at EU level. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jéromine, and we'll be sending participants a copy of your study, which is really, really fascinating. And I suppose just for listeners, just to be clear, when Jéromine references the lower house in Irish politics, she's referring to the Dáil, the upper house would be the Seanad. Yeah, thanks so much, Jéromine. I would love to talk a little bit more actually about the relationship between more gender equal parliaments and more progressive legislation and women's rights law. And I just thought it was really fascinating, you know, when you raised the fact that financial penalties, that for parties that are not meeting quotas, that they're more or less absorbing the financial penalty. And maybe we can talk about this a little bit more in the wider Q&A. So for now, I'm going to hand you over and invite Katie Deegan from Women for Election, who's going to talk us through their excellent work here in Ireland, in the Republic of Ireland, on women in politics. Thanks, Katie.
Thanks, Rachel. So I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to present from here. Okay, so Women for Election. So on today's agenda, I'm going to look at who we are, our training and what we provide, and then what we want to see. So what are the goals for Women for Election, and what do we want? So who and what is Women for Election? We are an organisation and we facilitate bespoke training programs, events and mentoring supports that have helped hundreds of women get elected to local and national level, as Rachel mentioned previously. We were founded by two ladies called Niamh Gallagher and Michelle O'Donnell back in 2012. They were both young women and they had been working together on the Lisbon referendum campaign. And whilst knocking on doors, they encountered hundreds of women that had said to them, I'd really love to get involved in politics. I want to be a campaigner. I just don't know where to start. I don't know how I feel about it. And I just need the help to get to make that first step. So they came together and they created Women for Election. So some of the basic training, which is kind of our core provision that we do in Women for Election, is our training. And we provide loads of different trainings, but the key ones are things like Inspire. So Inspire is the beginning of your journey. You're starting to think about running for election. You might need to get that confidence boost, network with some other women in your community that are also thinking around the same lines as you. And that's where you start. So you start with Inspire. You build your kind of team of people who will help support you throughout your journey to election. Then you move on to Equip. So our Equip campaign school is definitely a more intensive, usually spread over 2 or 3 or 4 days of a really intense training session with a combination of online and in-person support. These sessions will target the real nitty-gritty skills that you'll need to run for election. So those things from, when you knock at the door, what do you say? When you're pulling your campaign team together, who do you ask? What are the positions on a campaign team? What does that look like? We do really intensive media training with mock interviews with some of the best journalists in the business. So that's definitely more of your A to Z. Everything you need to know before you get out on the campaign trail is our Equip. Most women that we train at our Equip level will be on the road to selection or possibly already selected by a political party, or some of them have made the decision to run independently already. Then we provide masterclasses, and these are more kind of bespoke topic related training sessions. They're usually about an hour to 2 hours online, and they'll cover things like social media promotion. They might be about curating your message, and they're kind of the more kind of topic heavy issues. Then we do council programs. So our council programs look at working alongside city and county councils to develop programs that will address the needs of the women that they have in their community. So we've done a good few of them now over the last year. We worked with Offaly, Cork, Limerick. We've got so many more in the pipeline now on the lead up to 2024, but they usually look at things like, what does your council do when you are elected? What's the best way to make the most out of your first 2 or 3 weeks? They look at things like the issues that are happening in your community and how to create a successful campaign on them, introductions to local media, all of those kind of things. So the specific program that I'm going to concentrate on today in a bit more detail is our More Traveller Women for Election program. This program was kindly supported by IREC, the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, and we worked alongside the National Traveller Women's Forum to develop the actual body of the training, and then we worked with the Traveller Cultural Awareness Training Group down in Cork to provide some of the sessions. It was really, really important that Women for Election work with Traveller women's groups to design this, so that we weren't just telling Traveller women what they wanted, that we were working alongside them to curate this, and that we had the influence from the actual community. So what this is it's an innovative training and mentoring program designed for Traveller women to encourage and empower them to explore the possibilities of running for election. And I suppose the reason why is that we have no Traveller women ever elected to our local or national government, despite there being strong participation in community leadership. In 1982, when Nan Joyce became the first Traveller woman to run for election, unfortunately unsuccessfully, we have had subsequent Traveller women run, and we've obviously had the appointment of Senator Eileen Flynn to the Shannon in 2020 as well. We haven't seen the progress that we need to see for Traveller and Roma women being I suppose, supported to successful election in our current democratic system. So along with the National Traveller Women's Forum, we identified this gap, and we based our training session on the research project that was commissioned with the National Traveller Women's Forum and Akidwa with Dr. Pauline Cullen from Maynooth University. And their research aims to understand the factors that shape ethnic minority women's political engagement and their candidacy. So we brought together the best professional trainers that we could find, the mentors, guest speakers, and to try and explore ways to overcome those barriers. So moving on. So the first step for us was actually taking a step back from the training of the Traveller and Roma women, and it was to curate some cultural awareness training for the people already in the system, in the political system. So that meant political staffers of both the Oireachtas and political headquarters, the TDs, senators, councillors themselves, around, you know, what is Traveller culture, Traveller and Roma culture, what are the kind of misconceptions, the racism undertones to a lot of things that go on within our society. And this was really important to do this step before we trained any women to run for election, because we felt that there was a duty of care for us to the women that we were training, that we weren't just throwing them into a system that was already kind of, you know, racist towards them, that excluded them for so long. So this was one barrier then. This was one step to try and reduce that barrier and create a more accessible environment for Traveller and Roma women. So some of the training sessions that we did with the Traveller and Roma women over the 6 weeks, and this is really just a snapshot, were things like introduction to politics. So what is the current system? How does it work? Who's the who? Who do you need to know? We did confidence and resilience training. This is, you know, sometimes not always needed. A lot of the time, the women that we work with are more than confident and are more than resilient. However, sometimes it is nice to get into a space where we can identify some of the worries and the concerns that women might have and address them accordingly then, and kind of know that there's a community of other women around that feel similar to them. Then we did some intensive media skills training, like fine-tuning your message, finding your voice and fine-tuning your message. This was done with people like Orla Carmody, and it was a really intense kind of like one-to-one interview skill workshops and things like that, but really, really helpful for the women involved. And then we had fundraising first. So obviously we know cash can be a barrier to women running for it, well, to anybody really running for election, but to majority women running for election. So we did canvassing, fundraising and campaigning workshops with people like Dermot Ryan, Councillor Hazel Chu, and Senator Eileen Flynn, around how to kind of combat that and work towards to overcoming that barrier. And then campaigning and canvassing. So your bread and butter of your election campaign, with people like Dr. Gráinne Healy and Dr. Rosaleen McDonough as well. So really useful skills, because one of the things that we identified was that it's really important when working with any sort of minority group, whether it be Traveller and Roma women or LGBT women or disabled women or whoever, that we're not changing the content that we're providing for these women, that we're giving them the same content that we would give anybody that wants to run for election, but that we are tailoring it so that it is specific for them. And I think that was really key in all of these training sessions. Then, sorry. So these are just some of the snapshots of some of the women engaging in our training. It really was a brilliant 6 weeks. We all came out of it quite energized in what the future might hold for Irish politics if some of these ladies actually ran, which a few of them will be. So what are our goals? Women for Election want to see the introduction of gender quotas at local level. similar to what Rachel was saying at the very, very beginning, you know, in 2012, the Oireachtas adopted a law obliging political parties to select at least 30% of women candidates and 30%, and the threshold rose then to 40% from 2023 onwards. We obviously want to see that introduced at local level. Currently, if the quota is not met, political parties will lose 50% of their state funding they receive on an annual basis to run their operations. We want to see gender quotas introduced at local level, because although local government is 100% important within its own right, we know as a culture in our democracy, our local government is the bedrock to our national government. And if we really want to see a long-term, sustainable campaign for gender equality within our democracy, we really need to start and create that really solid base. And gender quotas is one way to do that at local level. Step 2 is the ideal 50-50 in all chambers. Who wouldn't want that? It's on my Christmas list now for the last few years. But that is from all the smallest of the smallest chamber all the way to the biggest parliament. And we want to see that 50-50 gender split. We want to see a safe and productive political environment for everyone. So that goes to the kind of the topics of the abuse that some female politicians face. We want everybody within the political system to feel safe, but we also want them. We also want it to be productive. We want women to go into the system knowing that there is change that they can make, in all aspects, and not just the stereotypical, areas where women dominate in things. We want to see women in the areas of finance, economics, and so on and so forth, feeling like they're able to, their voices are listened to, and they're able to enact the change that they want to see. And then the last, I suppose, is a diverse and representative democracy. We really want to see a democracy that reflects the society in which we live. So the women that we are training and supporting to run for election, we want to ensure that that is as representative of the women that are out there. So all the way from ethnic minorities, LGBT women, we want to see disabled women, and we want to make sure that we are as accessible to everybody, so that when we do get to 2024 and elections beyond, that our candidate pool looks exactly like the society in which they're trying to represent. So some of the free resources, and I know the National Women's Council are going to supply some of these links later on. Some of the free resources that Women for Election provide, so our website is womenforelection.ie, but we also have a really cool resource on our website called our Women for Election Data Hub. And this is a historical database of local, national, and European elections, which you can go on and play around with the statistics. You can filter by election, by year, by gender, by constituency, and it gives really visual examples of where there might be black spots for gender equality, where we need to do more work, where things are progressing, and it is a really, really useful tool, even if you want to see what's kind of happening in your own constituency. Our newsletter is where you will get all of our training. So if there's a woman here watching that's thinking that you want to run for election, our newsletter is the way to go, because that's where we will give you all the dates, times, and places. We've got 3 new pieces of research on our website. I know I'm running out of time, so there's 3 there. I won't go into them too many details, but one really good one is the 5C scorecard, in which you can see the progress that Ireland has made on the 5 Cs that are barriers to women running for election. And then, of course, follow us on our social media as well. It wouldn't be a presentation if I didn't plug them. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions later on.
Thank you so much, Katie. Your training, it actually sounds amazing, because you're not just talking about training for the women, you're actually looking at the institutions that they're going into. I suppose similarly, the toolkit that we developed for local authorities, like, it similarly tries to address those structural issues. And I'm really looking forward to the Q&A, so maybe we can talk a little bit more as a feminist movement, what more can be done to encourage traveler and Roma women, migrant women, disabled women to participate in decision making. And just to say, there's loads of questions coming in on the chat, so keep them coming. Next, I want to invite Aoife Clements from 50/50 NI to talk about her work in the North in encouraging more women into politics. Thanks so much for joining us, Aoife.
Thank you for having me. Let me just pull up my screen.
Don't worry, Aoife, these things happen.
Oh, I just realized I recently updated my operating system, and now it's asking me to give permissions again.
Okay.
Okay. Shoot. There we go. Can you see it? Yeah.
Yeah. Just do you want to go on to present? Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
Perfect.
Okay, so we are 50/50 NI, as Rachel said earlier. We work in Northern Ireland to increase the number of women in politics in this region of Ireland. We were founded in 2020, just at the end of the pandemic, by myself. And we are completely volunteer. We're unfunded at the minute. But hopefully that'll change in the future. But yes, at the minute we're unfunded and we're working to get more women into politics. So Northern Ireland, like, while it has very similar barriers to other places in Ireland, the UK, and Europe, there are often very particular contexts around some of the barriers just because of our like post-conflict context. So, I mean, our foundational document, the Good Friday Agreement, from the very beginning, women are kind of sidelined. There's only one line in the Good Friday Agreement about women. And this line was fought very hard by the Women's Coalition of Northern Ireland to get that in at all. So women's representation has kind of been pretty low since the beginning. But since the first elections after the Good Friday Agreement, there's been a very slow increase in women in our political institutions, but the progress has been pretty slow. So as you can currently see, at local level, we have 31% women, we have 37% in the Assembly, and then at Westminster, among the Northern Irish MPs, 22% of them are women. And as Rachel actually mentioned in the beginning, in the local election this year, as you see, we had 31% women elected, but 31% of the candidates were women. So when women are put on the ballot, they're elected, and that pattern was also visible in the last Assembly election and then the general election before that. So these barriers, is pretty clear that they don't exist at the ballot box, they exist at the party level. Parties, including Sinn Féin, the Green Party, and People for Profit, do have internal quotas, but a lot of the other major parties don't have quotas inside the party and also remain pretty resistant to them. So notably the DUP and Alliance are both pretty anti-quotas, which is very disappointing. There was some work started on introducing some legislative quotas for the Assembly in Northern Ireland, but that has been held up now due to the fact that we don't have an Assembly or an executive. So some of the barriers that exist, as I said, are pretty similar to the rest of the world, but again, have these like particular undertones of Northern Ireland. So they include, like, the big ones that we are trying to work on are lack of support from the parties for women, online and physical violence for women who are running for election or are elected, lack of support for mothers in politics and people with caring responsibilities, a lack of confidence among women that want to run, and women often just don't know where to start. So with a lack of party support, this is a huge issue. So in the recent Assembly election, we saw a pattern of women, particularly women who were first-time candidates, being placed in unwinnable seats for their respective parties. So in Northern Ireland, because of our post-conflict context and because of our political situation, we have a higher than average number of what's considered safe seats. And so, I mean, this is a problem, but also parties should be using this as an advantage to get more women into politics. But unfortunately, a lot of them aren't. So, for example, the UP, which is a unionist party in Northern Ireland, placed a first-time woman candidate in West Belfast, which is probably the most nationalist part of Northern Ireland. So like she was never going to win that seat, and it was very performative. And then the same thing happened the opposite way. The SDLP, which is a nationalist party, placed a woman in East Belfast. And again, this is a very unionist part of Northern Ireland, so they were never going to win that seat. Also, when I spoke to this SDLP candidate that was in East Belfast, she did remark at the lack of support that she had been given, that she didn't really have anyone to canvass for her, that she was recruiting her own kids to help her go out and canvass, which was really disappointing to see. And some of the really great women that I spoke to during this election, who were maybe first-time women or maybe running for the second time, weren't elected because they were put in seats they couldn't win, or they were put as secondary candidates to well-established male colleagues, actually have left their parties now and will be running again, which is really, really disappointing to see. And while all women are generally underrepresented in politics, there is specifically an issue with unionist women. Unionist women are particularly underrepresented in Northern Ireland. So, for example, in the Assembly election in 2022, the UUP returned no women to our Assembly, and in our 2023 council election, only 20% of their councillors are now women. And similarly for the DUP, less than 30% of their MLAs are women, and only 23% of their councillors are women. So this is a huge issue within unionist parties. And when you move to Alliance, Sinn Féin, SDLP, they're all, I mean, not where they should be, they're not 50%, but they're all at least above 30%. So this is a particular issue for unionist women. So to tackle this, we've actually been working with parties, we've been lobbying them, sending them policy briefs, to try and increase the number of sort of gender positive policies within the parties that there can be, while we can't move forward on legislative quotas. And I mean, the response has been generally positive. UUP have created an internal women's group, so for a bit of peer support for women within the party, and the DUP carried out a piece of research on this issue within the party. So that's promising to see. And then other parties, they already have internal quotas, so they didn't need as much encouragement from us. And then, yeah, so these are some pictures of our little campaigns that we've done during the elections, where women are showing their support. And basically, we sent them t-shirts, they posted pictures on social media about why they're running and why they think it's important for women to run. And that's just, part of our destigmatizing and trying to normalize women in politics. So confidence and not being sure where to start is another huge issue. I really hate to say that women aren't confident, but it is an issue that comes up again and again. So a lot of the women that I've spoken to who are candidates, who are interested in getting into politics or who are already elected, will kind of give you the same story about how when they were first approached, they weren't really sure, they needed a lot of encouragement. And I spoke to a Tory MP recently who used to be head of recruiting for the party, and he mentioned to me that when he would approach a woman to be step forward and put her name in the hat, she would hem and haw and maybe take a few months to maybe sometimes over a year to fill in the form and get it back to him. Whereas when he approached men, saying, I think that you'd be good at this, would you be interested, they would have the form filled in that day and straight back to him. So there is a massive confidence gap, which is disappointing. So yeah, women sort of remark that they often don't feel qualified to run or to take that step into politics. So on top of this, the confidence, each party in Northern Ireland has its own structure. So it's often difficult to know where to start in terms of getting into a party and how to get your name on the ballot. So to tackle that, we've developed our training program. It is called the Hear Her program. And it's a very robust program that covers a few topics, just to give women the confidence, the knowledge, the skills, and then everything that they need to successfully step forward into politics and run a successful campaign. So our structure is usually that we start with covering what the main policy issues in Northern Ireland are, what the structures of Northern Irish politics are, what does the day in the life of an MLA look like, what does the day in the life of a councillor look like, so that women feel completely informed or like, yes, this is exactly what I want to do. And then we kind of move on to utilizing the media, using social media, what types of social media are better for like what types of politicians. So for example, Facebook might be more useful for a councillor, Twitter might be more useful for an MLA or an MP. And then how to use local media, which is really important, especially to councillors. And then we move on to some exercises around like canvassing, how to successfully canvass on a door, what to do if you get asked specific questions. And then we usually go over like what the main questions that are coming up on doorsteps during that campaign are, so people are like feel prepared and confident to go out and like start knocking doors. So our training program has been quite successful. This is the most recent one that we ran this year before the council election, and a few of our women here that had been running were actually elected, so we're really happy about that. So one of the other big issues in Northern Ireland, I mean, obviously across Europe as well, is violence against women who are in politics. And again, it takes on its own sort of form in Northern Ireland. So during the Assembly election in 2022, 3 women that were running for election were actually physically assaulted while out canvassing, and many, many more were victims of online violence. And there were a few really high-profile cases of online violence against women that were running that caused like a lot of personal damage and lasting damage to these women's like mental health. In Northern Ireland, again, it's kind of specific because there is this violence against women and misogyny, but it often is also wrapped up in and has undertones of sectarianism. So what we've done for that is we've worked with the PSNI during this election and other women's groups in Northern Ireland to create a toolkit for women. So during this election, there was a toolkit available for women which detailed to them all of their rights, what they can report, what is considered violence, just to make it really clear to them that they don't have to accept this behaviour on the doorsteps or when they're out canvassing, and that they can report and they can get help. And then on top of that, we are in the Centenary Action Group, which is a UK wide group campaigning to get more women into politics on a national level. And with them, we are working on the issue of women's safety and lobbying on the digital safety bill in the UK. And then again, a huge one is mothers in politics and those with caring responsibilities. There's virtually no support for mothers in politics in Northern Ireland, which is really very disappointing. There's no maternity leave for MLAs or councillors, and at the national level, there's only maternity leave for cabinet politicians, so that wouldn't include any Northern Irish MPs. There's no creche at the Northern Ireland Assembly, and there is no space for when they're feeding their babies at the Assembly. On council level, there is a provision for childcare, but virtually all female councillors that I've spoken to say that they're unsure how to access it, and that the system seems to be a system of reimbursement for cost, but that isn't very helpful when council meetings are in the evening and most childcare providers are not open in the evening. So it's not very helpful. Virtual council meetings really helped during COVID, so that women could just do the meetings from home. And while some councils are still providing that, a lot of women did mention to me that even though you do have the option to join from home, there seems to be a stigma around choosing that option, and that women who choose to join the meetings from home are often seen as kind of like lazy and, you know, not willing to come into the chamber, which is really disappointing to hear. So to tackle this, we are part of the Childcare for All Alliance. We're campaigning to include women in politics in these campaigns to get a robust childcare strategy for Northern Ireland, which it does not have, and to ensure that there is a creche facility at the Assembly and also space for women that want to feed their children at Stormont. Yeah, so these are some of the organisations that we've been working with on these issues. Childcare for All, getting childcare for women, the Women's Policy Group in Northern Ireland. We've worked with the police, obviously National Women's Council, and then some of the UK bodies here, Centenary Action and Elect Her, to tackle these issues that we can't solve on our own. So big issues, you know, like violence against women, the childcare issue and things like that. So far, we're very happy to have impacted the number of women in politics in Northern Ireland. There's been a rise in council and the Assembly in the last 2 elections. So hopefully that continues to happen. And hopefully when we get our Assembly back up and running, we can move forward on legislative quotas for Northern Ireland, as I really think, you know, they're pretty necessary and a useful springboard to kind of get women to where you need them to be, so then it can be maintained. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aoife. I'll just get you to stop sharing your presentation. I have to say it's really incredible that you're doing all of this really hard work unfunded, so fair play to you. I'm going to ask all our speakers to turn their cameras on, if you don't mind, so that we can move into our Q&A. We've got lots of really interesting questions, and the presentations were just brilliant. It's just so exciting to see all of the ongoing work across Europe and the island of Ireland to try and increase women's representation. So lots of solidarity in the space, lots of solidarity in the chat box as well. So thanks very much, everybody. So I suppose just to start with, one of the questions that came in was aimed at the Women's Council, and it was around whether the family-friendly toolkit for local authorities is something that local authorities will be implementing. And I just want to say that we're working closely with local authorities to look at that. And I suppose the strength of the toolkit is that it's not totally prescriptive. It's basically, you know, to give ideas, spark actions, you know, talk to your councillors, see what works for you in your local area, and it builds on good practices. So yes, certainly that's something that we're working closely to make sure that is implemented. So this next question, it came in a number of times in the chat box in different ways. Basically, like, we know that women elected reps face a lot of abuse, especially online. It's a massive deterrent. It isn't addressed enough. Women feel like they need to be resilient and just take this. It's kind of par for the course. And Aoife, you talked about your toolkit. But I'm going to go around and ask everybody, maybe starting with you, Aoife, what can we do to fight this?
So I think what the PSNI did in Northern Ireland is really helpful, where they give the women the tools they needed to deal with the abuse. It's not really the answer, because it's not actually stopping it, it's just teaching you how to deal with it, which is not really good enough. I mean, obviously this is an issue that no one organization can, or no one state even can solve on its own, because it's such a massive issue. But I think that for me, the big thing is the social media companies need to be dealing with this properly. It's too easy to create an anonymous account, abuse someone, delete that account and create another one, or get banned and create another one. This shouldn't be how it's working. People should be held accountable for the violence that they're carrying out online, because this is violence. Yeah, so I think the onus is on these huge social media corporations to do something about it. Even the UK Digital Safety Bill, I mean, it looks promising. It's great that they've specifically mentioned women in it, but there's only so much this legislation can do if your troll is outside of the jurisdiction. You know, like if I'm in Spain and my abuser is in Germany, like the bill's not really going to do much for it. So yeah, I think the onus is on the digital media companies.
Yeah, thanks, Eva. I have to agree with you. But what do you think, Katie? I mean, something that in the Women's Council we've identified is the fact that a lot of times abusers, these trolls, are actually members of other political parties. Like, is there a role for political parties there?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, I do think the onus is on everybody to take it as seriously as possible, because I think even in the last few years, there was a mentality that if you got a hate comment online, you blocked it, you deleted it, and you moved on, and you kind of just got over it. But I think now, especially post-pandemic, when our whole lives went online, it's gone beyond that now. It's this incessant targeting of women, and then what's happening, what we're seeing is that it's turning up in person. So although it might start online, is that it does end up resulting in maybe somebody heckling on the street or showing up in front of a door. Now, I will say, and obviously Women for Election have worked hard with the Ceann Comhairle to establish the safety task force, which will, you know, commence soon, and hopefully we're hoping there will be real tangible, like, to-do list basically that will come out of that will start kind of ticking off some of that wish list that we have to protect people in politics. But I would also ask people to refer to our research projects, because what that does show is that the women that are running are doing it anyway. Like, they're saying, I recognize that the abuse is there and I know that it is, but sod it, it's not going to put me off. I'm going to do it anyway. And, you know, they're kind of thinking, well, you know, haters gonna hate, kind of, do you know, that kind of way. Like, so I might as well put myself into the arena and actually try and make the change that I want to see.
Thanks a lot. You know, I might actually just move on to the next point, and I think it's really interesting, and I suppose it does feed in a little bit to the online abuse thing. But do you think there's a link between the rise of ruling nationalist parties and the rise of the far right and gender equality outcomes? The example of Iceland in terms of reduction in women's participation seems significant in this regard. So that came in the chat box. Jéromine, maybe if you wouldn't mind, I'll start with you. Like, what's your experience of the sort of the rise of nationalist parties, the rise of the far right, and its impact, I suppose, on women's representation, women's rights legislation?
Well, what we observe at the EWL, but also more specifically through national members, is the rise of the anti-women's rights movement. So there is a backlash that is not new, but that was potentially intensified during the COVID, also through the digital arena. The different, as it was mentioned in the chat box, national government that maybe change political colors to less or more conservative parties, and less favorable, like government less favorable in terms of women's rights improvement. So from what we saw in our study, there is always a link in terms of higher women representation in government and better legislation when it comes to women's rights. We had the case in Portugal we looked at Spain, we looked at France, we looked at also Belgium, and there is a correlation there. Obviously, there are different factors, but it is one of the factors leading to better legislation. And it's true, there is always a debate, I think, within the women's rights movement, and when you push for better representation of women and quota on what kind of woman you want as leader, that's always a debate. You know, some people would say that, for instance, if you look at what happened in Italy, with Meloni, is this really an improvement? But I think it's important also to keep in mind that more women in decision-making position also means more diversity to a certain extent. So we shouldn't use, obviously, this rise of conservatism that is happening in Europe to, you know, shortcut general advancement for women's rights and stop campaigning for something that has proven efficient.
And Katie, Aoife, are you noticing an impact of the rise of the far right across the island in your work, or on the women who are interested in running?
Yeah, so like I mentioned in my presentation, the more right-wing parties in Northern Ireland, the unionist parties, this is a specific issue for them. I mean, I've engaged with them and they say that they care about this issue, but in the last two elections, like the proof was not there. They just don't have the women candidates stepping forward, and they're not supporting the women candidates. And then we have seen, I mean, because of this like global rise of the far right, but then also there's been a lot of polarization in Northern Ireland as well because of Brexit and things like that. That as they're moving to the right, we're seeing less women, and the women that are kind of allowed in there are these like more token women who are kind of representing their ideal woman, if that makes sense. They have to perform their gender in a specific way to fit in these parties. We're finding that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. What about yourself, Katie?
I mean, definitely on the online space, we have encountered an increase in abuse of anonymous accounts, of no matter what we say or what we do. We seem to get trolled. And there was one particular time around International Women's Day when it got particularly bad, and, you know, I was getting sent pornography and all this horrible stuff. And it seems to be in very targeted ways that people come together. And the likelihood is that if there's 10 accounts, anonymous accounts, attacking you for the work that you're doing, there's probably one or two people behind them realistically, and they've got several accounts. But so it seems like a lot more, and it seems but it's definitely not something that we take lightly in Women for Election. And we are underpinned by, we work with all parties across the political spectrum and none, but we are underpinned by the UN Charter for Human Rights, and we ensure that we uphold those values as well.
Thanks. Jéromine, did you want to come back in there?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Katy just said on the trolls and the online violence against women and women in politics in general. I think there's also something to look at in terms of financing, which groups are financing these trolls and these groups, and regulating that too, on top of obviously the platforms. And just to add in the context of the EU legislation, the EU directive on combating violence against women and domestic violence was adopted recently, and some provision of this directive focus on online violence. So it would be really important. The EWO is campaigning for a swift implementation of the directive. We launched a petition where we collected about 80,000 signatures that we delivered to the Spanish presidency of the EU. I will circulate it, but it's important to harmonize standards across Europe, as it was mentioned by Aoife. So I think there's also an opportunity to seize there and to follow through this kind of EU legislative framework.
Thanks, Jéromine. And so this kind of next question, it came in a couple of times in different ways, and I suppose it's around getting that balance, because obviously we want to see more women elected, but we also want to see more diverse women elected. And so this came in from Emma, and it was thinking about broader representation and the need for initiatives for minority groups such as the traveller community. Is there a need for flexibility on quotas to ensure broader representation, or what can be done to ensure that women's representation is not diminished to accommodate broader diversity in all chambers? And this came in from Rachel. What supports can be developed to ensure that women can survive and thrive when elected, especially women from minority groups? So this event obviously is coming from the All Ireland Women's Forum. Like we represent diverse communities from right across the island, and we do hear this a lot of the time that minority women do need additional supports. They face additional barriers. And Jéromine, in your presentation, you in your research, you looked, there aren't that many initiatives really aimed at diversity sort of beyond gender. Katie, your training, it sounds really amazing. So I'm going to throw it open, like, what as a feminist movement, what more needs to be done? What more can we do to encourage traveller and Roma women, migrant women, disabled women, and other marginalized women to participate in decision making? Aoife, I might just start with you. Mike, there's your microphone there. Yeah.
I think I would have learned by now. At 50/50, we definitely need to do more in terms of diversity. We really want to see the women in our politics look like us. That means women of colour, it means queer women, trans women. What we want to do is kind of expand our training and then create sessions that are exclusively for, say, women who are LGBTQ or women of colour or traveller women. That's what we want to do in the future, to give them the specific support that they need, and then have those sessions led from someone from that community. That's kind of what we want to do in the future to help with this. And I mean, in terms of quotas, there are lots of examples around the world where quotas are really like dynamic. So I can't think of any of them. I think that are requiring, like, say 50% of women, but then within that, women from particular communities. So I mean, that is definitely something to think about when we're campaigning for quotas. And again, in Northern Ireland, when we kind of get our government back and can move forward on this, is important, I think, to have your quotas and your 50% women, but make sure that those quotas fit your specific political context, and then have room to ensure that the women that we get elected aren't all just like cisgendered white middle class women, because if that's the case, then we failed. So
okay. Jéromine, I might come to you next.
Thanks. Just to add, it is definitely possible and doable, because it's often one of the arguments against quotas for higher women representation and a more diverse representation and reflective representation of reality. But like, if you look at the institution at the EU level, for instance, the European Parliament, you have proportion to be respected in terms of which country gets how many seats in the European Parliament. So you already have this kind of diversity quota to represent geographical diversity. So it's possible to implement. You have to choose the right system, but there are systems existing. So it's doable. It's about how to do it and like have the political will to do it specifically and put the resources behind it also, because sometimes you have the will, but you don't really have the resources to put things moving. And yeah, I think it's about quota obviously help, but other connection policies, for instance, when it comes to migrant women, for instance, I mentioned the internalized barrier, you know, so one of our members does a lot of work to support women from migrant background, for instance. So I think it's like a multi-phased approach, but it's definitely possible. And unfortunately, in our study, we try to look at the EU country that would be front runner in this type of quota, and except our Welsh member that tried to push but didn't succeed so far. We saw that Portugal has, let's say, a quota for people with disabilities, but it's not specifically targeting women, and it's a quota only applying, or let's say a target only applying to public administrations, not national election or parliamentary elections. So it's quite limited.
Right. And I suppose it goes back then to the kind of the points you raised in your presentation, Jéromine, around like examples of that link between more gender equal parliaments and more progressive gender equality legislation, and having the right balance of women, diverse women and men. Obviously, you would presume that there would be better outcomes to represent all of those groups. And there's another question. I'm conscious of time, so I want to move on. What advice would you have for progressive young women thinking of getting involved in politics? It seems like, especially at local level, there's the same men in the county council for years. You know, so it's difficult, I suppose, to appeal to young women. I mean, from my point of view, I think the types of decisions that are made at local government level, when you think, you know, these are decisions around housing, roads, libraries, I mean, I think they impact probably on women and young people more potentially. So it's so important that they're at the decision-making table. Katie, I'm going to put that one over to you. What advice would you have for progressive young women to encourage them?
Well, the first piece of advice I'd give is get in touch with us. Little shameless plug there, but definitely do get in touch with us if you are interested in running for your local government. I mean, local government, like I said previously, like it really is the bedrock to everything that we do in our democracy. And there are really important decisions that are made. Some people can kind of maybe underestimate how important it can be to our lives, because we take for granted that the bus stop is just there, or, you know, whatever the case may be, or that the new school was just built. But these are all really important things. And I think, you know, if there are young women that are thinking about running for election, they should definitely reach out to people like us for support and training, even if it's just a conversation. Like, you don't have to commit yourself to anything, but then also go to your chamber. I mean, you don't even have to talk to the current elected councillors if you don't want to, but talk to the women that are in there, talk to the admin support, the people who, you know, run the council from the inside, and ask them what is the next step, like what are the issues that are happening within this council, because it is very specific to each local electoral area. So I think predominantly it's talk, ask, be curious about the questions, and then take it step by step, and go from there. Don't get too overwhelmed.
I think that's great advice. And I'm actually because I'm so sorry to those who put their questions. We've had some amazing questions in the chat box that we're just not going to get to because of time, but I'm just going to go around and give you each 30 seconds. I know, what a horrible thing to do, put you on the spot. But just maybe some concluding remarks and, you know, maybe some advice. Aoife, I'll start with you. Mike. Sorry, Aoife, microphone.
Oh, again. So I guess my concluding remark would be, like, it's great that we've seen this like slow, steady increase in women in politics, but it's not fast enough. We need something that's going to really boost the numbers, and that is quotas. And then alongside that, like parallel, we need these cultural changes. So we need crashes, breastfeeding rooms, we need all of these things. And then, you know, if you are a woman that wants to get into politics, get in touch with us. Just go for it. Pick a party. No party is going to be perfect, so just pick the one that you think aligns best with you. And yeah, get in touch, and we can help you out and get you ready to run.
That's great, Aoife. Katie, I'll come to you next.
Yeah, so similar to Aoife, get in touch with us. We will do whatever we can that it is that you think you need support with. Talk to the women around you, bring women with you. If there are women in your life, maybe you run a local group, maybe you're scout leaders, maybe you're on tidy towns, whatever it is, or even if it's just your group of pals and you talk about the same issues over and over and over again that are bothering you, bring them with you and have your team with you. Maybe, the more the merrier. We need that critical mass of women. And I suppose the last piece of advice would be, don't be afraid to talk about all issues that you're passionate about. Don't just think about the issues that you think women should be talking about. Talk about whatever it is, whether it's the economics, the budget, finance, justice, whatever the case may be. You go and you talk about it and run with it.
100%. That's great advice. Thanks, Katie. Jéromine, I'll come over to you next.
Thank you. I'll focus a bit more on the EU level. There are opportunities created at the EU level in terms of legislation that will need to be translated at national level. So it's important to keep an eye on that and to keep pushing. And the EWL is quite active on, I mentioned violence, but the European election campaign will be also quite active. So if you are interested and if you want to learn more and participate and support, please follow us. I will be sharing some of the resources I mentioned. And there are opportunities at the EU level, but there are also missed opportunities. This last mandate, for instance, we could have had quotas at EU election level, and we missed this opportunity. Well, the council mostly missed this opportunity. So we need to keep pushing, and having some member states already being front runner in this area will hopefully encourage EU legislators to harmonize all of the standards. Thank you.
Fantastic. So sadly, that brings our discussion to an end today. I'm sure we could have continued. This event has been part of the work of the All Island Women's Forum. You can find out more about the All Island Women's Forum on our website and social media. It's a fantastic group of women from right across the island. It's a really powerful space. I'd encourage you to learn a little bit more about that. So listen, enormous thank you to our speakers, Jéromine, Katie, and Aoife, and thank you to our ISL interpreters, Vanessa and Sarah, for their participation. Thanks to the leadership team and the National Women's Council for pulling this together. Just to say to our participants, we're going to send you the links to the various pieces of research that were discussed today. So please take a look at those. I hope you found today's event informative. I certainly have. I've certainly found it very inspiring, and we look forward to working together, building the solidarity to ensure our democracies actually reflect our societies and increasing women's representation. So thanks very much, everybody. Have a great day.